Got it. Right. I'm back, everyone. Welcome to session 2, using big data to combat insider threats. What we plan to do with this session is split it into two parts. This first part, a one-on-one in conversation with Jim, and then Jim will leave the stage, and we've got 3 panelists who will come up, and we'll continue that conversation with them. Again, another great lineup of panelists for you. Before I introduce properly, again, I just want to set the context a little bit. Obviously, the names Robert Hanssen, Edward Snowden inevitably spring to mind when we talk about insider threats and the damage individuals can cause organizations. It shouldn't come as a surprise that a trusted insider who turns represents one of the greatest threats, I think I'm right in saying that, to a company or a government. I want to quote from an excellent white paper that, again, I read on the plane yesterday from Rachel Hulis and Eric O'Neill, which said, and this just put it as clearly as it could be, they have, and talking about insiders, they have authorized access to authorized systems and are using that access to do unauthorized things. You couldn't really put it more clearly than that. So what to do, how best to combat the threat, proactively detect it, even preempt it. We've got the National Insider Threat Task Force Program, instituted post-WikiLeaks that we'll talk about today, the Continuous Evaluation Program, another system in place designed to identify suspicious behavior, the DIPMAT program as well, the Defense Insider Threat Management and Analysis Center set up, I believe, by the Defense Department. That's designed, I think, to be predictive rather than reactive, using big data as well, so particularly pertinent to this. My guest on stage believes that while big data brings with it great risk, given the amount of data and information readily available, it can also equally provide great opportunity if we can make that data work for us, not against us. Jim Dinkins, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Jim is Senior Vice President, Global Enterprise Financial Crimes Compliance Operations, one of the longest titles I've heard, US Bank, where, among other things, he leads the anti-money laundering operations teams, also a former Executive Associate Director of Homeland Security Investigations at the DHS. The programs I mentioned just now, Continuous Evaluation, National Insider Threat Task Force programs, DIPMAC. Honestly, your thoughts on those?
Well, since I don't work for the government anymore, I can say.
There you go.
And plus, we need to liven up this group a little bit. That last, it was depressing sitting through that last one about all the you know, the bad things that happen with big data and the internet.
Right.
But you know, it's also for every technical advance, which is usually done for good purposes, even the Tor network, right? It wasn't developed for nefarious purposes.
No.
But yet we know that criminals...
It was developed by government for government, wasn't it?
Yeah, right? And we know that opportunities that criminals just find the weakness in every opportunity to exploit it. It's how it's been forever. Since they built roads and they started, you know, hijacking tractor trailers that were going across the interstate. So criminals just take advantage of those opportunities. And I think what we have to do isn't from a law enforcement and a government and from in the commercial industry is figure out how we can take advantage of those to combat those same threats that they're exploiting through the growth in technology. So those programs are really important, but I think it still goes back to, and let's kind of dumb this really down to, at the end of the day, we have all this big data, right? That's what you hear about all the time, you know. And when I left DHS, at HSI, I had 10,000 special agents and analysts, and vendors would come in and say, we've got the perfect solution for you. We can analyze, Twitter data, or we can analyze social media, and we've got this, you always hear things about like, data lakes and data warehouses and the cloud. And as an operator investigator for 28 years, I'm like, well, do I need, water wings to go into the lake, or do I need a plane to go in the cloud? Because neither one of them are actually in the sky or in the water. Right. So how do you actually just take advantage of all these things that people are talking about? And at the end of the day, is all an operator or an executive wants is answers. They want answers. They want answers of who are at risk in their population, from externally who's maybe trying to attack them, but also more importantly or equally as importantly, all this focus has been on, these external intrusions and attempted intrusions. But what about the staff that we have right amongst us that we have to give access to our trade secrets? We have to give access to our classified information.
So what you're saying, Jim, is rather than have all this data thrown at them, they want you to go and pick something very specific, an answer for them, and give that to them on a plate. And are we getting there?
I think we are getting there. I can tell you that I think that the message is being heard by industry, who really, quite frankly, the government doesn't build anything very well. It takes industry to build it for the government. So I think the industry's heard that, and they're coming up with solutions and answers to provide proactive insight to that big data versus just trying to throw up on the government and throw up on executives with all this data that now, even with 10,000 employees, I was like, I'm going to have to hire another 1,000 just to analyze that, to come up with the answers and insight that I'm looking for.
I just, apologies for this, but I let you off the hook a little bit with your view of those programs in place. And I'm just going to quickly go back there. I know there is this 5-year review. Every 5 years there is this review, and you feel that is clearly leaving big gaps. What else is wrong with these programs in your view?
Well, I think that the entire industry is kind of retooling from the government side as well as corporate America, is retooling how we do the onboarding of employees and then the periodic background investigations. So in the government, you go through an extensive investigation, they get onboarded and get your clearance, and it goes beyond clearance. It's just there's other people that have critical access to information that don't have to have a national security clearance. Proprietary PII information in the government and so forth. So you get that nice deep dive 5-year. Say, yep, you're good. And then we're going to redo it in 5 years, if we get to it. But then things happen and we might be 6 years. But what happens from the time that you're onboarded to that 5 years is anybody's mystery. So you are required to self-report things. Oh, well, I'm getting a bankruptcy and I have financial challenges and or I've been arrested. You're supposed to self-report that. But if you're an employee that is struggling and crashing and burning basically, right, you don't want to lose your job. You don't want to lose your clearance. So I think there's also a perception of possible, driving these people not to want to report certain things. But there's the technology out there to actually be able to check to see if they are reporting what they want live, not waiting for 5 years to do it and say, oh yeah, guess what? Little Jimmy's been divorced. His house has been foreclosed on, and he's got a DUI. He's going to crash and burn. He is so acceptable to be an influence, even if it wasn't his intent when he joined the company or joined the government. He is now so exposed to external influences, to corruption and so forth. And also that type of emotional dilemma in somebody's life can actually turn them against the organization that they're working for, because now they can start to grow, well, why isn't my employer here stepping up for me? And, why are they not more understanding of my personal situation? And now you develop an adverse relationship with your employer, and that's one step out the door to being an insider.
Back to finding answers. The sort of umbrella question has got to be, what do you think is the best way of detecting insider threats? Back to this point about finding answers. How do you find the needle in the pile of needles, if you like? How do you find the right needle?
You embrace technology for that, right? The same technology that people are exploiting, you need to embrace that to find that needle, right? You build good, solid models and algorithms, and then you risk score that activity and that behavior. I don't think that it's that uncommon for when you sign onto your work computer. It says, everything that you're doing on this is going to be monitored. People accept that, right? Okay. I think that people can accept, in society, can accept the fact is if you get arrested, which is public information, that your employer would be notified of that. I don't think that's that big leap. There is a big leap for some reason that if I post on Twitter that I am going to go to work and kill my boss, that is something sanctioned, that's the holy grail. You can't use social media Let's not talk about that. For some reason, that's like been off limits, and I don't know if it's the 30-something-year-old crowd that grew up on it, or what it is. And we obviously want to protect people's freedom of speech, right? But if I'm going to tell the world that I'm going to go and I'm going to tweet that I'm going to go, kill my boss or blow up a building, for some reason, when law enforcement uses social media to protect themselves, it's like it's gone too far.
So social media needs to be part of this process.
Yeah, because because as we've seen from ISIS, that's what they're, people are overtly communicating, and people want today we live in a society that people want to tell you, they just want to do it. They want to tell you they're going to do it, and then they go do it.
How do you convince employees that they're not, or how do you stop the risk of alienating your employees through constant monitoring?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and you don't do that with people, right? Because even if I'm sitting at home and know that somebody's signing on, I don't have Facebook, right? But my people in my family do. Mm-hmm. It seems very intrusive to have somebody from work reading my my wife's Facebook. Mm-hmm. Don't use people to do that. Use technology to do it. And the only time that a human interacts with your posts is when something's triggered that you're at risk, and sometimes that can be to protect you. We have service members that are around the world that are exposing themselves and their family members to attack from foreign governments as well as radical individuals, because they just don't know that what they just posted in social media has just identified their location or their family members, and now they've exposed themselves. So you can do things automated with machines doing the detection, and that humans only intervene. Quite frankly, you don't even need to know the employee's name while it's being screened. What you're looking for is the behavior and the red flags.
And that's enough, is it?
Yes. And then now, boom, now little Jimmy is just posted something's going to happen.
And then the human gets involved.
Then the human gets involved. Okay. You peel back the anonymous number, and you find out that this is little Jimmy that is in section D of the workplace.
Jim, who's doing this really well? Who is finding that answer for the client and saying, here it is? Who would you hold up as best in class right now? And it doesn't have to be in this country.
Right, and it's a tough question, and I'll tell you, because there's internal, right? So you have your internal indicators from workplace. You have, monitoring your keystrokes. All of a sudden you have an employee that's coming and going at the odd times of the day when he shouldn't be coming and going. He's printing out information. He's downloading information. So you have I don't want to say a crowded space, but there's a lot of tools in that space. I think they're getting more and more sophisticated, because you still need to peel that back and say, well, yeah, all of a sudden there's a surge in printing because it's the end of the fiscal year and they're doing RFIs and RFPs and they're responding, so there's logical reasons behind that excessive behavior, and how many people do we have to have in our employment to look at that excessive alerting. So that technology is becoming more and more analytical and providing answers rather than just all these alerts all the time. And then there's the external indicators. So there's the external indicators that are saying, we're going to mine through sophisticated algorithms public information. Maybe social media, but maybe not. Let's just look at the public information, liens, judgments, criminal arrests. Yep. We're going to mine that. These are reportable things that almost everybody's mandated. If you have a clearance, you are mandated. But even a lot of companies that aren't in the security business mandated, if you're arrested, that you have to notify them. And if you're a financial institution, if you're in a bankruptcy situation, there's a lot of oversight in that. So I've only seen so far one company that's kind of tied all that together and seamed it all together, and you guys can ask Doug Thomas and Lockheed, right? Okay. They have, and why is this? I think that you have to have the will of the company. They're willing to invest in that, and the knowledge.
Deep pockets.
Well, I don't know about deep pockets, because if you use technology, it doesn't cost as much as having a whole. I think you'd be shocked at how many folks that Doug has.
Why would the company not want to invest in that?
Because it's a cost, right? And profits, and you have shareholders.
But not too bad a cost.
Right. So if you can bring it down and you can use automation to do that for you, then there's that balance. But also you got to look at, companies are starting to realize, and I mean even more so. If we talk about some of the most notorious insiders in the government are not the ones that have done even the greatest damage. There's insider traders that are arrested routinely over the years, and some of them have caused the lives of people overseas, right? that you may not hear about, you may not know that much about them, but it happens. But in the private sector, if you're like, say, Lockheed or Boeing or Pfizer, you spent literally tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to build the next widget, and somebody is disgruntled with you and walks out to your competitor the next day or sells it to China, you've just wasted tens and tens of millions of dollars and set yourself back possibly 10 years.
Right. I imagine the government doesn't help the private sector that much. The private sector is expected to put their hands in their pockets and pay for their own programs. Yeah. What does that mean for government working together with the private sector in the future on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's going to be key. And in some sense, I think that the private sector is starting to lead the way and driving that change in the industry because, I spent 28 years in the government. They're very reactionary, and they're slow to react. I think profits and losses.
Hence these programs we talked about at the top.
Yeah, profits and losses can drive change really rapidly, and that's what I've seen in the industry. Not that they're not good, but they need anytime you come up with policy in the federal government, it's a very archaic and long process.
So how do you incentivize the private sector to work together with government?
Well, I think one thing is you start rewarding people when they're doing government work, that they have actually taken it upon themselves to develop a clear insider threat program, protecting themselves. We should do that because we will punish them if they let that trade secret out the back door to China when it was a controllable item or something that was licensable technology. So why not incentivize and reward them at the time when they're going up the bid for the next big multi-million-dollar project or $100 million project, that they have actually policing themselves actually farther in advance than what the government's even requiring them to do.
Something like, we talked about it in the last session, the OPM breach. What does, and having worked in government for so long, what does something like that do to the psychology and the mentality of those people trying to solve these issues in government? How has it changed the picture, if you like, and has it changed the picture for the better, would you say?
I think it's very frustrating. My information was gone, right, and stolen, and and luckily I'm now out of the business, still, but yet, I think it's even more frustrating for the people that are actually working right now, possibly maybe in an undercover capacity. And it's just not the intelligence community, it's law enforcement too. There's thousands of undercover operations that are going on today in law enforcement that now a foreign nation has your fingerprints and your biometrics and your family. We no longer need the honeypot of this, sexy guy or gal sitting next to you at the bar befriending you. Now foreign governments have thousands of people trying to infiltrate you from externally. Now they know all your weaknesses. They know everything about you. So they know I don't have a Facebook page, but they know who my wife is, so they can go after her Facebook page and try to befriend her. So I think it's very frustrating, and I think it just goes back to how neglectful we are as a government to have exposed that information without this security protocols. Because I can tell you, in the private sector, when data is stored, especially PII information, the majority of commercial that do a living off of that data acquisition, they're storing it encrypted at rest too. Not just, if we can keep you out of the front door, we don't have to worry about you when you get in the house. Most commercial companies that live and breathe on it, like Thomson Reuters, that PII information is stored at rest too. So it's mind-boggling that the federal government didn't do that.
Okay, before I throw it out for just a few questions for you, Jim. In the last session, we talked about, well, we had to ask that question. I ask it now. Who is winning this battle? And it seemed to me, as you rightly said, that there was this pessimism. It's a really tough one when it comes to terrorism. What about in this space, insider threats? You guys looking at big data, trying to find the answer, that little needle in the stack of needles. Who's winning it here?
Well, definitely. Two things. One is a lot of these issues are not issues that law enforcement can address themselves. It's not things that, we can't arrest our way out of, sex trafficking and child pornography. We can't, a lot of these things that, and you turn to the law enforcement, a lot of law enforcement folks and said, are we winning it? And we'll never win but through enforcement, right? It takes a whole regime change to win. And right now, I would say when it comes to insider threats, we are losing. We have the capability to win, but we're just on the cusp of it, right? So, we're just now getting to the point where it is becoming, companies are adopting standards that say, hey, not only are we going to look at your emails and your work emails and your work computer, but we're also going to monitor your external behavior and taking it to the next level, right? We're just now getting there, and companies are kind of just now getting there. Government's just getting there, getting away from the 5-year archaic, like, oh, you were good 5 years ago, so that means you're at no risk for the next 5 years.
And when just final one from me, when will you, Jim Dinkins, look at this and say, and when do you think you will be able to look at this and say, now we do have the right things in place to fight this effectively? 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what do you think?
I don't think we ever will, only because it will be something new.
Right.
As soon as you crack and solve one problem, they're off to another one. So you got to be forward looking ahead. And it goes back to, I heard a computer company speak, the CEO of a computer company that we'd all know, but I'll leave him nameless, saying that of one of the leading software companies in the world and computer hardware companies in the world said, this year, 90% of the products that went to market in that company did not exist a year ago, right? So how can you ever crack what is not even on the market today? But I think it takes a will. And so I think as we craft the will and the understanding that, and it's socially acceptable for us to use big data to root out bad actors internally and externally, when that is okay, and we've worked out all the policy issues about that, and that's not my problem, right? That's what society wants us, the will to do as far as how we use that data, and what I'm willing to give up as a citizen to keep me and my family safe. That's, I think, when we've cracked it, no matter what technology's out, we've already come to a common understanding. Unfortunately, the farther we get away from 9/11, the less people are concerned about the real terrible things that people are plotting against us every single day.
Scary thought. Okay, let's have some questions for Jim. Yeah, lady here, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I actually started blogging because I was considered an insider threat to a corporation. I was targeted as the #2 security threat to a car company because I inquired about them taking taxpayer money to build an electric car, and they did business with Iran, and I thought they were breaking sanctions. So then what happened was they outed me as a former researcher for the CIA in the 80s. My family was their CIA. So, and I was involved at 19. I started going to embassies as a house guest during the Iran-Contra era. So I didn't tell the man that I was married because I didn't talk about it for 17 years. Then when I started talking about it, I was considered an insider threat, but I'm like, I'm not an insider. I'm an outsider that's maybe how to look inside, but I would never consider myself an insider. So when I looked at data and I started blogging, I had to cancel my Facebook. I had to do all this stuff to get the people out of my life that I did not want to hurt, because I knew some of them, again, had security clearances. So when you talk about insider threats, I never would have been a threat had somebody not have outed me and destroyed a 17-year time period where I was quiet. I never told anybody what I did. All my friends were shocked. I lost most of them because it was devastating. And now with the OPM hack, people are coming up to me because they feel how I felt in 2009. And there has to be a way to use data to benefit society, and maybe that's transparency. So maybe the millennials will cure the problem, and we're going through a cleansing right now. Do you think that could be what's going on, a cleansing, because we have to be more transparent as a nation?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think transparency is key. On one of the earlier panels, somebody had mentioned the fact is that they didn't want to, there was a county or a government that did not want to disclose the prosecutors that were having each of the individual cases, and so that you could actually use that information. We have to be transparent in our justice system, because you have to, and I think definitely if you look at law enforcement at large, they're definitely going through a cleansing. People are self-reflecting on with all the scrutiny that law enforcement are under right now, and they should be, right? I mean, we should readjust our standards and what's acceptable practices in law enforcement, as well as the government, and then how we use that big data as well. So it's important to always, I think, test ourselves and how we're going to use that big data. And it's probably something that has to continuously, it's not something that can be, we can solve the problem all in one, swoop and stroke of a pen. It's something I think you continuously have to do.
Okay, yeah, question here.
And it's Heidi Salo from Thomson Reuters. So I have a comment and then a question. My comment, when you were speaking about the use of social media to detect insider threats, one thing you didn't mention, and it's probably beyond the scope of this discussion, is the fact that particularly outside the US, this ties into the earlier panel, we have to worry about employee monitoring and data protection laws. And so there's definitely a conflict, I think, in some cases. Some countries have exceptions for data security, but some don't. And it's something that I think a lot of multinationals have to grapple with. Again, the conflict there. So that's more of a comment. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. And then I had a question.
Yeah, you want to comment on that quickly?
Well, definitely, I think that that adds the challenge when you're a company like Lockheed, and it'd be interesting to hear how they're handling that. But when you're a global company, there's different privacy laws in every location, right? But it's also, I think, up to us as a society to lead the way to say that there is nothing that is the holy grail that you're going to post to the world that for some reason we can't use to protect ourselves, right? And I think maybe that's bias from law enforcement, but if you're going to tell the world that you're going to do something, why shouldn't law enforcement be able to do and use that information to take action to prevent that from happening?
The second thing is a question. So you talked about the fact that it should be automated, right? So, and that makes sense to me. But to what extent, I think I know the answer here, but to what extent has the government adopted things like DLP, data loss prevention, data leakage protection? It's called different things. To what extent have they adopted those kinds of tools? Because that's a great way, I think, to detect red flags. Again, people using like their Gmail account to download sensitive documents or send things to themselves or others. So I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think definitely within the federal government, the one thing that they do very well is they monitor your systems, right? So I ran our Office of Professional Responsibility for a few months, and I could tell you every keystroke that somebody did on our system. I knew your keystroke. I could tell if you hit enter or didn't hit enter. So we do that monitoring of that system very well. But once you leave that property, you're on your own. It's somewhat Wild West until we do a reinvestigation for 5 years. So as long as you don't hit the porn from work, or you don't do your online gambling from work, and you don't do bad behavior from work, then you're okay. Because they block so much other off your computer, it really becomes a dumb computer other than for what you can use it.
I think it's easy to block based on certain content of sites and so forth. Yeah. I think it gets more challenging when you're looking at things like access to personal email accounts. Where do you draw those lines? And social media that might be related to one's job. So LinkedIn or Twitter that might be related to one's job. But interesting. That doesn't surprise me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to have time for one more question for Jim, if someone's got a question. Anyone for Jim? Just, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Real quick, sometimes it's not the lowest level employee with divorce problems or whatever that you have to look for. We found in some instances it's the executive suite.
Sure.
It's the board of directors. We're looking at 100, however you measure it, because people debate this, but a lot of intellectual property stolen each year from corporations, weapons systems, blueprints stolen from the Pentagon. A lot of this required some inside help. We're quite convinced, in talking to some people on the inside, we believe it wasn't just an outside penetration. How do you stop those who are motivated by big money from doing this?
Yeah. It's always greed, right? That's the root of many of our issues in society is greed. And then, as we talked about, the sex trafficking, just despisable individuals. But that's a very good question, and that does open up because we live, with all this big data, right? We've exposed so much of our data to so many people, and we really have to for them to be the function to do their job. And if you're an executive in a government organization or commercial sector, right, you're getting all kinds of information to help lead and direct them and steer them in whatever direction that the board, if you're a board member or whatever. So it opens up a big vulnerability. And I don't think that there's an answer of how we can stop that from actually happening, other than through awareness. And I think it comes back to, you almost have to have like a zero tolerance policy for your, whatever if you're in a government agency, your code of conduct, you have to enforce it all. You can't just enforce the big things. It starts down with, like, I've had employees that got fired for voucher fraud. We had a better system to detect the very first time they hit enter, they would have not got to the point where they are actually submitting something to fraud, because people think there's a human nature that if I did something once and I didn't get caught, then that's okay, and they take that next step, and before too long you have somebody that's just they're going to jail instead of being reprimanded. So I think that you have to instill a culture of compliance and adherence to your policies. All of them, not just the big bad ones. Yeah. And I think if you look in different police departments that have taken that approach too, those are the societies that we all want to live in, because they will actually write you up for a traffic ticket or give you a warning instead of only responding that when you're calling for help because your house is on fire.
I started by mentioning Hansen and Snowden, and to your point, you talked always about financial gain. I think fair to say financial gain for Hansen, ideological gain for Snowden.
Yeah.
Fair to say that, I would imagine. Just to come full circle on there.
Well, I don't know. That's probably giving him too much credit, right?
Sorry.
That's probably giving him too much credit. I think that this, it probably goes back to, and I'm not a psychologist, but we live in a society where people have 300 Facebook friends and they have all these followers, and everybody thinks they're important, right? And the reality is, you're not that important to the government, unless you're breaking the law or you're Chapo or somebody like that, right? The government doesn't care. You're not that important. You can have 1,000 friends and 1,000 followers. They don't care. Okay. And I think with Snowden, he found out he is not that important in life. And he wanted to be important. And so he did something that he thought would make him notorious and infamous, not because he had some ideological issues against it. That's just my own.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Can of worms. I said I opened it. Jim Dinkins, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure. Thanks. Right. I want to invite. Thanks a lot, Jim. I want to invite our other panelists up onto stage. Brandon Wales, Director of the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. I'm going to move up one. Take a seat here, Brandon. Todd Rosenblum, Senior Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here at the Atlantic Council. Also a Senior Exec for IBM, which I didn't know, but I do know now. This is Todd at the end here. And in the middle, Douglas Thomas, Director of Counterintelligence Operations and Investigations at Lockheed Martin, which, of course, is a company Jim mentioned just now, so great to have you all with us on stage. Brandon, I am going to start it with you, and I do want to step back, and I do want to hear your definition of insider threats. I read this remarkable statistic, and tell me if it's right, or if it sounds right. I believe it was a study made by Cisco that 11% of employees reported that they or fellow employees accessed unauthorized information and sold it for profit. Does that sound right? I find that astonishing.
It's, I think historically we've seen that employees, internal employees, are likely always the largest number of those kinds of insider threats, and it makes sense. But frankly, I think the bigger concern in kind of modern business, working with our private sector colleagues, is really the deperimeterization of what it means to be inside of a company. That given globalization, supply chains, moves to the cloud, who is your employee? Who's protected by your insider policies, your analysis, your key logging may be completely inadequate. And so that number makes sense, particularly in light of the fact that we believe that most companies are likely underestimating what the scale of their insider threat problem is, both because of this idea of a broader set of people who have privileged access, given the changing way that businesses operate in the 21st century. So I think that 11% number may be right. It could also be far lower. We don't know who are the third-party vendors who may be doing the same exact thing that may not be caught and identified and cataloged in that way.
All right. Let me come to you, Douglas, just on the back of that. We heard Jim hold Lockheed up just now as a best in class in one area of this. Brandon said just now most companies underestimate the scale of their insider threats. Do you think Lockheed is underestimating it?
I feel like I'm being interrogated with these lights, so I'm on the defensive.
Sorry, don't be on the defense. I want to have a conversation.
I don't think we underestimate it. I don't know if we have our arms completely around it. I mean, one of the things that we had to do is develop strategies to mitigate the threat. We believe the threat is there. We believe the threat is in everybody's industry and in the government. How large is that? Who knows? But you have to develop programs and processes, and we did do leverage technology to understand the problem set and do something about it.
You have to spend money to put a decent program in place.
Not a lot.
Not a lot?
Yeah, because I heard you earlier say,
yeah.
I was actually listening over there, not napping.
Well,
And
he mentioned Lockheed.
I actually heard you talk about a lot of money. Well, for us, it really isn't a lot of money. You're going to hire people who have a good counterintelligence insider threat background. And then you're going to, if you're a large company, you might want to develop a tool and leverage technology. Okay, it's not that expensive. For us, developing it in-house, it was pretty costly, okay, because we started from scratch. But if you can buy something that's already built or off the shelf, it really isn't that expensive.
Right.
And I would say, I would answer it one other way. I don't know how a company today can afford not to have a program.
Right.
If you take a look at the statistics that the government has relative to the insider threat problem set, the trend's going in the wrong direction. The FBI has a 105% increase in economic espionage cases since 2009. If you take a look at the global economy today, okay, that's what is causing a lot of the insider threat problem. Companies are doing more and more mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, divestitures, large layoffs. The pension plan is no longer there, so that carrot of holding people loyal to your company is there. My point is the trend's going in the wrong direction, and a lot of it has to do with the global economy.
You know, Jim, just one final piece on this. Jim talked about companies not wanting to comb through millions of records and documents. They simply want answers. The program you have in place, is it providing you with that, would you say?
I would say it is. We're, the crawl, walk, run theory. We're kind of in a fast walk right now. We stood our tool up 20 months ago, and the results have been pretty phenomenal.
Can you give us some anecdotal evidence to illustrate it?
What I would share with you is that our capabilities on our network are pretty impressive. Okay, so we have a digital baseline. We have a digital behavior baseline of every employee in the company. Because of the tool we've built, that tool, the digital stuff feeds my tool. My tool also couples that with we have a human behavior baseline of every employee in the company. So what I'm looking for is anomalous behavior from an individual. I'm not comparing Doug to Jim. I'm comparing Doug to Doug over his atypical behavior.
Todd, how does IBM stack up? With your IBM hat on, how does IBM stack up to what we've just heard?
Well, a couple things. I'll begin with talking about precision of data, right? It's not millions of pieces of data, it's billions of pieces of data on a daily basis. Right? We're generating more data than at any point in history. We're generating more useless bits of data at any point more than history. What's the data that matters? So when you want to figure out what's the data that matters, it goes back to human beings figuring out what's something anomalous that you care about. Because all the algorithms in the world will not be effective if you haven't figured out what's the anomalous, unusual activity you want to care about. So just, from an IBM perspective, it's an investment more in, and IBM's not alone in this, it's investing more in understanding the mission space, because writing the algorithm is actually the easier part of it. I would just want to mention one vignette, because we've talked about in this discussion and in your previous discussions, the balance between privacy and security, and it's legitimate, and it's a fluid thing that's going to always be fluid. So by vignette, my son's a big New York Mets fan, and he's desperate to go to the World Series, and I'm desperate not to spend billions of dollars. So this morning, I went and searched online for how much tickets were, and I did confirm they're billions of dollars. Guess what's happened to me since I did that search at about 7:30 this morning? I have been inundated with precise ads about the New York Mets, about baseball, from Modell's, from Dick's Sporting Goods. So the precision of the advertising world and the data brokers is phenomenal and outstanding. I wish government could get remotely close to that level of precision. The tools exist. Again, it's figuring out what are the behaviors that you want to focus in on.
Yep.
And that's more the issue today, more than anything else. One final thing, and then I'll stop talking here. When I first joined the government 28 years ago, and I former colleagues out here, one of the first things I experienced was something that is really unique as an American citizen, and that's going through a polygraph exam, right? The polygraph exam experience is you're guilty until you prove your innocence. After you pass the polygraph exam, you sign forms. And I've signed forms at lots of different jobs now that I have given up every one of my personal rights and probably my grandchildren's personal rights. What that means is, for those who are government employees, there is an extra license to mine personal data, which I think is appropriate, because when you're entrusted, you have the right to, not have that privacy piece. So it's another issue where, within government, we're just talking the insider piece. Within government, I wish government was more effective about using intrusive tools, because it's not the public at large we're talking about.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about that as well. Brandon, you heard what Jim said about the programs, the continuous evaluation program, the DIMAT program, etc. Was it fair what he said about it? Are they woefully inadequate?
I would say that they're designed to create opportunities to detect insiders. That this is not a problem with a silver bullet. That there are a lot of tools that can be used, and the government will slowly adopt them. The government slowly adopts, I would say, all technology tools. As anyone who's tried to work on a government computer network knows, we're nowhere near the cutting edge. We will slowly add new tools that give us increasing likelihood of potentially detecting that there is a problem. Not one of them is going to be the answer. Together, they're going to give us better opportunities to find someone. Are they enough? No. Will we continue to pursue and we continue to enhance and make them better and potentially over time adopt some of the technologies that the private sector is beginning to use? Yes. And I think that will make us stronger. Until then, we'll continue to use all available means. There'll be the programs we have. There'll be the existing tools like background investigations. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to some of the items that Doug discussed, which is how do you both use that information that you're getting through those kind of programs like continuous monitoring together with things like how do you better leverage what I would call the human intelligence of your colleagues so that I know my colleague is doing something strange or inappropriate. Is there a mechanism in place that kind of openness to highlight it is there? And that may not be. And I think the more we create those kind of opportunities, the better chance we have of detecting that or finding that needle in the sack of needles.
Yeah.
Can I comment on
Please.
something he said, because he was spot on this? So we've also put together a pretty robust training and awareness campaign, getting the word out to our employee force that they're a target, the company is a target, the ramifications are significant. I can't overstate the importance of a good training and awareness campaign. And one of the things that we were trying to do, besides let people know that they're a target, is we also were very careful with our wording of this, because what we did not want to do is create a culture of snitches. We wanted to create a culture of employees being engaged for their benefit, their job's benefit, the country's benefit. So it's really careful how you use words.
And do your employees get that?
Yeah, they do.
They do?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen a significant increase in reporting of all different kinds of things. Most stuff I don't care about. But but a lot of different things. And so I think the training and awareness campaign has been effective. In fact, we did a survey before we did it, and we did a survey 2 years later after we did it. And we've seen a massive increase in awareness and reporting. But we don't call it reporting, we call it engaged.
So what does Lockheed, I mean, I don't know if you can tell us this, but the way Lockheed Martin sells that program internally, what are you doing differently to other big companies who fail to sell them successfully internally?
That is a great question, because I tell you, there's long poles in the tent with setting up a program like this. Selling your C-suite is one of those long poles in the tent, because a lot of people think that this is intrusive, big brother, you know, this office is rogue. It's none of those. So what we did is we wrote a concept of operations. It was a team sport. You had HR, ethics, legal, privacy, corporate information security, and communications, because we knew we wanted to be somewhat transparent about the program as well. So it was a team sport. We wrote a concept of operations. Legal and privacy reviewed it. They took it outside counsel. They came back and said, legally sound and regulatory sound. That doesn't answer the question, is it in line with your corporate values? Because different cultures, you can stomach different programs, right? So we put together a really robust governance structure. I brief the board of directors once a year. I invite internal audit in to audit. Are we executing the mission based on the concept of operations? That's legally sound and regulatory sound. I brief our risk and compliance committee, and every 3 months I brief our insider threat steering committee. So when you hear that you've got this oversight, this governance structure, you've got a legally sound and regulatory sound program, you've got internal audit coming in, and oh, by the way, you are a threat because we've demonstrated what a target you actually are, people embrace the idea more if you can put those kind of pillars in place.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One of the things I want to add to this is I was at an event yesterday, and we were talking about the role of human beings in terms of insider threat prevention, and insider threat prevention also means making sure an outsider doesn't penetrate your network because of your own sloppy computer hygiene. And so the discussion went like this. I am not a technologist. I'm not a ones and zeros guy. I'm a policy guy. And joining IBM was interesting culturally for me because they're technologists. I said, okay, take someone like me. It's really hard to read through a manual. And it's really hard to understand all the steps you want me to take, both on insider threat and then technically to my system. So I said, from a human standpoint, automation is vital here, because you can't make it too hard on human beings to take too many steps. And here actually is where technology can be very helpful. Let me give a quick example. Studies are showing now that for those who are looking at closed circuit TVs or staring at a screen, and when they're looking at it for an hour, guess the percentage of information they're actually absorbing looking at that screen? It's less than 5%. Human beings' ability to absorb, human beings' ability to, constantly take manual steps to update and follow best practices is always going to be imperfect. So what we want to use tools that can expand the sort of, wheat through chaff looking to the maximum extent possible. So what you put on human beings are steps that are easily understood, easily done, and are collegial in effort. Because otherwise, we're simply not, my view is, we're simply not going to get in front of it if we make it too complicated for humans.
Before IBM, you worked for government. With the government hat on, and now with the benefit of hindsight, what is and again, back to, as we just talked about, and with Jim before as well, these programs that are in place, what is the government getting wrong?
I think the first thing the government's getting wrong is the rule set is the rule set, and the rule set makes government operations well below suboptimal, right? That's the first point to make. As I mentioned in this vignette with my son, and if my son's watching, I don't want to spend the money for the game. Right, so when we talked about the SF-86 and the application for security clearances and the 5-year review. Well, we have a process that we initiated back in the 40s for doing security clearances, about people knocking on your neighbor's door and asking, is this person a good American? And do you know someone else who's a good American who could vouch whether this person's a good American? Before we had access to vast amounts of data real time, that was logical. Today, as I mentioned, right, real time, there's billions of bits of data being created. And government is hamstrung. Again, I respect why, because as a government, we have to balance our privacy and our constitutional liberties with security. But the fact is, government is limited in its tools. It can't go to a data broker. It can't go to Google and subcontract to say, give me what you're collecting and analyzing on this person, because they're doing in 15 seconds what someone knocking on a neighbor's door, one could never do and does over a 6-month period of time.
So you're saying the government's hands are tied and they can't do anything about it?
Government's hands are tied, but I'm not complaining because I'm respecting that there's a balance between privacy, civil liberties, and security, and it's a national consensus that people have to wrestle with. But it's important to recognize the rule set we have in place will always make government very suboptimal in this mission space.
Brennan, I don't know if you want to comment on that. And you know, this idea of government's hands being tied, you know, post OPM breach, you know, and I spoke to Jim about the psychology, you know, and the shift on the back of that. What do you think? Is that fair?
I would say that the government is a very, very, very slow adopter. So the issue is not so much that we will never get to the point where the government may be looking into its personnel that have agreed to get a security clearance and signed waivers that you can get their mental health records, et cetera. I mean, if you sign away your waiver to give your credit and your mental health, does it not too far to stretch that you should also have access to your Facebook and Twitter? But it's going to take a long time for the government to get there, because it is just a slow adopter for those new tools, which is why that you put a lot of other ways, there are a lot of other actions that they try to take to compensate for that. So whether it's using enhanced measures to protect data. So OPM breach was extremely bad, so now we're changing the way that we protect PII across the government in terms of encryption and other things, increasing who has access to certain types of systems, using two-factor authentication to reduce the opportunities for malicious external actors, and like in the case of OPM, to cause the breach. Those are compensating for the fact that we don't have yet the tools that are being employed by places like Lockheed Martin or that are being alluded to by Todd.
Just on the back of that, and external actors and OPM breach and fingers pointing at China, how overly optimistic do you think it is to consider this this pact, if you like, between the US and China to be real and tight?
On that one, I'm going to defer because my boss's boss will be here shortly, and I think that's among the issues.
He can answer that question.
Well, it's on the issues I think he's going to touch upon in a more broad sense.
What do you guys think?
I'd like to defer to his boss's boss. So I spent.
Come on, you're allowed to say this now.
So I spent 35 years in the government, and these kinds of pacts, if that's what you're calling it, a pact, I don't know. My faith in something like that is not screaming high.
I think, first of all, I share the enormous skepticism of this pact, but sort of more fundamentally for governments, it's very, very important that when a government decides to enter into an agreement, it has enough meaning to it that you haven't diluted the credibility of the concept of an agreement. And I'll leave it at that.
And you're suggesting that's exactly what happened, right?
Implicitly, perhaps.
and first off, I haven't seen all the language in the pact. Okay,
Right.
So let's say they, and I don't know, I'm just making this up. I do that a lot. Okay, but let's say the pact says that we won't go after companies like Sony and Target. Okay, but let's say you still can go after the Lockheed Martins because it's still part of that national security apparatus, if you will, because we build weapon systems, right? Okay, so I would be curious what the language is in the pact, and I would still be very questionable about the effectiveness of it. It's too lucrative for companies to steal our intellectual property, our R&D, and our trade secrets to sign that away. That is a tremendous gift for them. That's the target today. It's less about classified information today. It's more about R&D, trade secrets, and intellectual property. Again, it goes back to padding global economic woes.
Where does that relationship, I mean, I know we're broadening this a little bit now, and I'll pull it back in a second, but I'm fascinated with this because, of course, Xi Jinping's in London at the moment. Where does that relationship go?
What relationship? Us and industry, or us and government?
US-China. cyber threat?
Oh, well, I think they'll continue to work on it, but I think you'll always hide behind the cloak of non-attribution. I think this is a problem set that's going to be around for a long time, quite frankly.
I would only add that any types of confidence building measures which is probably what I would call this in another context, that we would have with China are only designed, again, to supplement all the activities that we are trying to do internally to the government to better protect our information that we're storing, whether it's on our personnel or on our operations or on our intelligence, et cetera, and the work that obviously is done by industry or done in cooperation between the U.S. government and industry to protect other types of sensitive information. So there's not an assumption that, okay, any types of these confidence building measures are enough. Therefore, we don't have to worry about all the other projects, programs, efforts we have underway to better secure the type of information that may be desirable by external malicious actors.
So I don't want to be completely negative on it, because I applaud the government for trying to go down this road.
Yep.
Okay, I think anytime you can try to have some kind of a treaty or a pact or a deal, I think that's a good thing. I'm just not optimistic that it's going to be worthy.
I think, so we're looking at something structural, right? Humphrey Bogart said it well in Casablanca. He's shocked that there's gambling, going on here in this casino. Sorry for the poor attribution there. So espionage is what we're talking about. And espionage of both national security secrets, national security information relevant for defense industrial complex, et cetera. What's unique, I believe, in today's environment in regards to what China is doing is China is using the state apparatus to go after private companies for the purpose of stealing intellectual property. I think it was General Hayden who said it well, that it was, as far as the OPM breach, it's more shame on us to not assume we're a persistent target, which we are. I mean, that's what spies do back and forth. They try to collect useful information against each other. But I think where we're trying to get, we meaning the United States and other nations, I know with the UK as well, this notion that there is a constraint on the role of government in the field of cyber espionage. So will we get there? It's incredibly lucrative right now for adversaries. They've stolen enough to make enormous gains technologically and from their national GDP standpoint that I don't see a lot of disincentives for them to stop.
Right. Yeah, economic growth at all costs. Right, sorry for that digression. I'm going to bring it back to specifically using big data, insider threats. We talked, we heard from Lockheed Martin that the programs you put in place, this stuff needs to come from the top if you're going to convince your people of a worthy program that'll work. Let me get your view on who you think inside a company first, private sector first, and then we'll come on to government, should be involved in these sorts of programs. Who needs to be involved in these sorts of programs?
You talking to me?
Either of you two, Lockheed or IBM.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, it's a team sport. I mean, I need ethics involved because you want your program to be ethical. I need HR involved because you need their data. I need legal and privacy for obvious reasons. I need corporate information security because they can do some pretty cool things for us. And then my office. So it is truly a team sport. And I tell you, we advertise it along those lines too, because companies like ours, we place an awful lot of emphasis on ethics. Well, if ethics is involved from day one throughout this process, it makes people feel a little bit warmer towards the idea of a program along these lines.
How about you?
First, I hate when Lockheed plays the ethics card. So, yeah. Okay, so who has to be involved and how do you get people involved? There are financial incentives, there are business health incentives that make this a C-suite, a CEO level kind of activity. Business reputation, it's devastating to business reputation because there still is this notion out there that companies are going to be better than government at protecting their data. And while in certain sectors, actually, they've been pretty good, the vast majority of companies are also not 100% effective in protecting their data, and it impacts reputation. Second, in terms of financial, for example, it's a really interesting rise right now, the growth of the cyber insurance industry. So if a company wants to get insurance, liability protection, et cetera, it's got to have a plan in place that the insurance industry will evaluate and say, you are taking reasonable measures to protect your company and your information and your data before we will give you the insurance. So there's driving factors that have raised us to the very top levels, and I think it's, this is a new permanent state.
And that insurance is getting more and more costly, right?
And it's getting more costly because there's a lot of haves and have-nots out there in terms of those who have robust planning and those who don't. Because this is, again, where the marketplace is a beautiful thing. It will simply raise exponentially the cost of getting insurance if you as a company don't have a plan in place.
Yeah. Brandon, who in government needs to be part of this process?
Well, I think my answer is somewhat easy because as anyone who's tried to get things through a government clearance process knows, to get anything done in government, you need every single person to approve of it. But I'd say the answer is, in large respects, not very different than what Doug said. The people who are involved in these kind of programs are everyone from the security and intelligence side to the IT side to the human capital, the privacy and civil rights, civil liberties offices, et cetera. So I think these can only be effective if you're able to deal with all of those complex problems. And I think given the sometimes scary nature of programs that involve surveillance of employees, et cetera, it makes sense that you've got a broad number of perspectives that come to bear in terms of how these programs are set up, established, and then ultimately executed.
Another piece of this that I find particularly interesting, and maybe this is a little bit naive when we talk about big data, but this idea of trying to get to the bottom of what motivates a loyal employee to turn, the human side of this, nothing that a computer algorithm can spot.
Yeah.
What are companies and government doing on that front? Because this is clearly a very, very important piece of this, right?
So in my past life, I had a chance to meet with government officials in multiple countries, in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, Israel, and obviously within our own government and the UK government. How do you get at the countering violent extremism? How do you sort of find these indicators and warning? How do you interdict and disrupt individuals moving along that spectrum? And not surprisingly, there's lots of different techniques you can have. Nothing will ever be foolproof, right? Loyalty, disloyalty, incentives, disincentives, these are age-old issues. What we're talking about in the sort of digital age we live in today, there are faster and quicker ways to do disruption and to commit acts of violence or espionage, and there's faster ways to detect it. So it still is an offense-defense race. I think, though, as someone who reads some of the literature, look, there's never going to be a foolproof method to identify why people do something and then how you can disrupt and prevent them from doing so.
I mean, I would raise one point off that, and that is, I think that makes sense, the idea of trying to find what are these triggers and how you're going to find a disloyal employee, whether it's in the government or the private sector, is an immense psychological challenge. There are things, obviously, that you could do from technology to detect whether the person is beginning to, once they have decided to be disloyal, whether they're beginning to put in place behaviors that would signal there's a problem. And I think that's a lot of what we've been discussing. But to play off something that Todd raised, in the cases of CVE in the United States, 80% from a number of studies show that 80% of cases where there was a violent extremist, somebody else knew that person was going to do something before it happened. They didn't raise it early enough. And I think that gets back to the kind of points that Doug and I raised earlier, which is how do you create a culture where anomalies are raised early and can be addressed quickly, as before they get to the point of criminal activity being undertaken.
They both brought up great points, and You know, if you Monday morning quarterback a workplace violence issue or a suicide issue or an insider threat issue, everybody you interview, I knew something was up with Doug Thomas, you know? So that's why that training and awareness campaign is important. But as far as using the tool, you know, what you're looking for is somebody who's becoming somewhat disgruntled, someone who's being somewhat disenchanted, not happy with the company, not happy with their supervisor. Those are the kinds of things. And I don't want to completely rely on somebody coming and telling me about it, because in our DNA, the way we were brought up not to tell on our friends and our neighbors type stuff, okay? We don't want to be snitches. So I have the training and awareness program in place for those people who feel compelled to come forward, but I also rely on our tool to help understand somebody who's becoming disgruntled or disenchanted.
Just to add one more thing, when I was at the Pentagon, I was working on the response to the Navy Yard shootings and sort of the insider threat. There's the physical response activities, but there's also what you're getting at is detecting human behaviors that are moving down a spectrum of concern. And there was a lot of study work done, the Defense Science Board, others. They looked at this hard. And really what it came down to was it's a human relationship more than anything else. Technology can help, but it's not that often that people are going to, you know, Google in, how do I kill my, you know, boss? And I want to do it next Tuesday. Now, you always have certain people like that out there. But for the most part, it's much more subtle than that. And so creating this climate, and this is something in the military culture we talked a lot about, creating a climate where people felt comfortable both respecting an individual's privacy, their right to their religion, their freedom of expression, et cetera, but also being comfortable talking to that person or talking to your commander, your supervisor, hey, I think there's something unusual going on. And then having a system in place, having some expertise back. In DoD's case, each of the services have their own what they call threat management units. And that's having a body, a multidisciplinary body of people that you can consult with to say, someone in my base, someone in my installation is acting in a certain way. Do you think this is something that, you know, requires intervention, counseling? And so you rely on that sort of back and forth. But first, you know, as Doug said, it's spot on. It's that environment where it's not an environment of snitching on others. It's an environment, though, of recognizing if there is something that is concerning you and behaviors, that you're comfortable addressing it with the person and or your boss.
Yep. All right, I want to open this up to questions from the audience. Who's got gentleman in the front? No, thank you very much for your input.
Sorry to do that.
No, please.
Thanks. I'd like to pick up on what Mr. Thomas said very early in the conversation about the mergers, acquisitions, partnerships. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with like a starburst investigation. We often find that the problems can occur when everyone thinks they know the parties involved that are coming in for this potential connection. But it turns out that if you really looked at the associations of the executives, the board of directors, you find some interesting connections with some nefarious partners at times. How concerned, when you work with third parties in any capacity, do you really feel like how much can you do to really determine, you know, that you know who you're working with?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm going to generalize this as opposed to a Lockheed Martin thing. When I was in the government, I saw an awful lot of different things. And what I would say is the amount of due diligence that a company does on the other companies that they're about to partner with, or the universities that are working on the next generation, whatever cool thing, okay, is almost nil, okay? We really don't completely understand who we're about to do business with, who's about to have access to our trade secrets and R&D and intellectual property to further that next generation whatever, or to further that business relationship to make profit for everybody. And I would suggest to people that if you're in that business of partnering with other companies or countries, you figure out a way to do some due diligence on those people, because we've just had lots of examples in our history where it has not been very good.
And I think, so from my time at the Pentagon, came to appreciate something called the Defense Industrial Base, the Defense Production Act. And what that is there's laws and there's policy that make in place, just because of the size of DoD and companies like Lockheed, there's an imposition of standards and requirements on supply chain integrity. It's unique to the defense area in terms of government acquisition. But once again, here's where I think the technology is really not that expensive to do deeper dives on your suppliers. And not just within the defense industrial base, but really, business to business and government to business, where you could do better validation of your partners and suppliers than is being done today.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah. Lady at the back there.
My voice carries.
No, wait, do wait for the mic. Thanks.
Actually, this is for Mr. Thomas as well, but you alluded to earlier, and this may be a bit of a philosophical question, but I think there's also a practical component to maybe some of the loss of, for lack of a better description, kind of the safety nets that employees may have had in earlier periods, not with your company specifically, but more, more broadly. So you were talking about pensions, but there could be other things added into that bucket. Are there other, beyond kind of building robust mitigation and detection technologies and tools, are there other things that the private sector or companies could do earlier in the process to not to detect, but prevent the emergence of a risk like that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I got to tell you, I get just as much thrill out of exonerating somebody or preventing an act and catching an act in place. I think that's a mature program when you can stop it in its tracks before it even starts. One of the things that we did is in Lockheed Martin, if you're going to get a notice of layoff, that's kind of a bad thing, by the way. I might have one waiting on me when I get back. But if you're going to get a notification of layoff, what we did is we worked with HR, and right above your signature block, it's a reminder of your obligation to protect intellectual property. Because why we did that, studies have shown, not our studies, but studies from CERT, Carnegie Mellon, have shown that a pretty high percentage of people, when they're leaving a company, they help themselves to that proprietary information. And in their mind, it might not be because they're trying to do something bad. In their mind, they've worked on that for the last 5 or 6 years, and they think that that's theirs, okay? So why we have that in there is kind of a reminder that that is intellectual property. It is a violation of law if you take it. We don't want you to do it, okay? A little bit about our program, though, is, again, I think it is in line with I think the privacy settings that we've put in place are very good. The training and awareness we've put in place are very good. We don't want people to go down this road. The last thing I actually want to do is run an investigation on somebody and turn it over to the FBI. We really just want to stop the act from happening, period. So I think the prevention mode is critical. And we do that in a couple different ways. In our company, you have to take ethics training every year. Well, one of 5 scenarios that you have to take is on insider threat. Again, it's a way to get in front of people of what this problem set. And there are real ramifications if you do this and you get caught doing it. And we just want to prevent that from happening. Good people make mistakes. We're there to catch them if they do.
Thank you very much. Yeah, gentleman at the back.
Yes, a bit of an intervening factor I don't think has been mentioned before, but I'll try to keep it as apolitical as possible. This seemingly regular threat of U.S. government shutdowns, furloughs, and increasing number of cleared individuals. I'm just curious if perhaps you've noticed a trend or correlation with, say, the number of these incidents where people are being contacted and, these political threats.
Is there a link there?
I mean, between the potential government closure, no. I mean, nothing that we've seen, but obviously, that could raise issues about people's disgruntlement with working for the government. But if you look at most federal employee viewpoint survey, I'm not sure that they need a whole lot of help. But I think the broader issue, I would argue, is the issue of the people who do have clearances, the right number. I mean, are we giving out clearances too freely? Is the need to know versus the need to share? Are we striking the right balance so that a person doesn't have very, very broad access to highly sensitive information that they don't actually need to execute their job. And I think a lot of agencies, I know that we in particular are looking at this issue from also from a cost perspective and a hiring process. It takes a lot longer to bring on someone with a TS/SCI clearance. Do they really need that to do their job? If not, it's cheaper, faster, and easier for me to bring them on at a lower level. They don't now have access to information that they don't need, and provide another opportunity for someone to do something. So I think that is an issue that the government will continue to kind of grapple with and look at.
I think to your question, and also keeping it apolitical, organizational esprit de corps is vital, whether you're talking about the government, you're talking about private sector, you're talking about unit cohesion in the military, or intelligence collectors in the field. Clearly, those who are government employees have been under, and I say this as a longtime former government employee, as my colleagues are here, have been under a generation of attack of, quote, being bureaucrats and, you know, just living off the public cash cow. And it is demoralizing, you know, on sort of a day-by-day basis. So what does government shutdown do? Government shutdown takes the process of sort of continual bashing of quote-unquote bureaucrats and turns organizations upside down in their management. So at the Pentagon, when we're going through the sequestration issue, our comptroller, tremendous, you know, capability there, but we're also talking about $750 billion to manage. So during shutdown, the threat of shutdown, you're asking your comptroller to start to build out a budget for the next 4 days, and then do it for the next 7 days. And how much can you spend as a percentage of your overall allocation you've been given for that year? And it's not only painful and inefficient and demoralizing, it really undermines the effectiveness of an organization. So it goes after the heart of esprit de corps. I would not leap to, therefore, it is encouraging insider threats, but what I'm talking about, the impact of, you know, sort of a perpetual going after government employees as a problem and making the executive branch jump through perpetual hoops. I'm also a former Hill staffer, so I've been on both sides of the equation, but I would say it does have an impact.
I do think your question is good, though, because, you know, we don't have a deep dive understanding of our employees' personal lives. You know, we don't know if somebody's going through marital problems or financial problems. And when something along those lines creeps up, okay, you don't know if that's the straw that's going to break the camel's back. If that one less stressor is going to cause somebody to, again, workplace violence, suicide ideations, or insider threat. Behavior is a very interesting thing to try to model.
Okay. Got time for one more, if anyone's got another final question. No one? Everyone's getting hungry. I will just pose one wrap-up question to each of you, and literally I don't want more than a minute from each of you on this, because I want to bring it back a little bit more to this big data. We heard Jim say in the Q&A before this that big data often means big problems, masses of information, big headaches on the one side, but of course there is this idea that big data is going to help solve these problems now, if you can find that needle in that needle stack. How optimistic are you, Todd, let's start with you, that we will find that needle in that needle stack?
Okay, two things. One, IBM has better ethics than Lockheed Martin. I just want to say that again. Two, what I would say is technology is allowing for far faster sifting through vast amounts of data. Technology allows us to have permanent memory and retention, meaning that once you have built into your algorithm, this is an anomalous type activity, you're no longer exclusively dependent on the human being who's the operator to query in that certain way. You're allowed to build on what the algorithm has done. Technology enables that speed to decision point. It increases it at an enormous rate of speed. And so there's hope in that. Obviously, the more volume, we haven't talked about the explosion of what we will see in terms of Internet of Things and how that will add another exponential layer of data to it. But when you have a tool set that is comprehensive, that is enterprise-wide, you have the best opportunity, I think, to go through data quickly so humans could focus in on what humans do.
So optimistic. Okay, Doug.
Yeah, I had what Todd said. And, and then Brandon said something earlier too. There is no silver bullet. There is no 100% solution. But without a program and without a tool in place to leverage the data, you have no chance whatsoever of finding that needle in the haystack.
I would say I'm optimistic that it will allow us to find more needles, but the real issue is we're not going to catch them all. Right. So what are the other mechanisms that we're going to use to create a more holistic strategy to be successful in combating this challenge?
Okay. You have all had more than 2.5 hours of me, so I'm going to wrap up 5 minutes early. I thank you all for your patience, and I thank Todd, Doug, and Brandon for your insights as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you.
The lunch keynote will begin in 15 minutes. Please feel free to